Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes on Friday, the 3rd of July, 2020. Today, we'll discuss how to streamline and improve your Agile team's delivery, improve throughput and productivity, and generally get better and releasing value more frequently with Chris Parsons. If this is your first time at CTO Craft, let me tell you a bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. The community numbers are over 1,250 and provides one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, online community, and events like this one. So today, I'm Glyn Roberts. I'm MC of this Byte session, and I'm the CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt. Our speaker today is Chris Parsons, who's the creator of Delivery Double blog at deliverydouble.com and Chief Film Technology Officer at Gower Analytics, where he oversees 25 people, a mixture of film experts, developers, and data scientists. So great to see you, Chris. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So like you just said, I've currently working as Chief Film Technology Officer. Before that, I was Chief Technology Officer, CTO at Gower Street, but I kind of took on a slightly more expanded role to take on more kind of operational staff at the beginning of this year. So my background is been in the technology sector working professionally since about 99, 2000, so quite a few years now. And I've been leading teams since around 2007, when I quit my job and started my own little client services company without a clue how to do anything really. And I hired a couple of people who were slightly less experienced than me, which wasn't saying very much. And tried to figure out how to do Agile, how to deliver software for clients. We were reasonably successful for a few years, but unfortunately, the kind of tech crunch in about 2011 paid. So since then, I spent quite a lot of time working with different teams, trying to apply the lessons I learned during that time, working consulting with Agile teams that are some teams that were very agile, some teams that were not so agile, some teams that thought they were very agile, but in fact were terribly not agile, and some teams that, you sort of walk in and think, oh my goodness, I'm surprised that everyone hasn't quit already. So a huge range of experiences working with different teams, and since about 2018, I decided to take the plunge and go back into permanent work for a bit. So that's what I've been doing since then.
Excellent. Well, great to have you here. Thank you for making the time for us. So for the audience, feel free to add your questions from the Ask a Question button below the video. And let's start off with grilling Chris about this then. So why did you create Delivery Doubled?
Okay, so at the beginning of the year, I've been kind of thinking about starting to write again for some time. So I've had a blog that's been running since 2006, and I've sort of pretty much neglected it for several years, and was quite keen to restart writing. I was getting steadily more frustrated with the way that I was seeing sort of the Agile zeitgeist, or the conversation around Agile going over the last few years. It feels like it's going sideways or backwards. It doesn't seem like we're going forwards at all. And some of the things that I've been teaching and coaching are kind of making their mark, but it does feel like there's more to do and more to say here, and more that we can do. And I think that a lot of big companies who often set the agenda with some of these conversations with their products aren't really pushing the conversation forward in a good way. So I'm feeling quite frustrated about that and wanted to actually add my voice to the mix to see whether or not I could kind of help people benefit from my experience. Plus, also, I've got plenty of failure stories. So I've posted, funnily enough, the failure stories on my blog are always the most popular ones. I'm not quite sure why that is, but lots of stories about how I've tried to correct team members and made a mess of it, or I've made announcements which end up me actually not telling the truth to my team without quite realizing it, and things like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those experiences, and also try and set that within the context of how we can deliver faster as Agile teams.
Okay. Excellent then. So my first question to you then is, what is Agile? Obviously, different people have different opinions on this, so I'd love to hear your view on that.
So Agile is the fundamentals of the manifesto to me. A lot of people, when they think of Agile, they think of Scrum, or they think of Kanban, or they think of SAFe, or they think of the Spotify model, or lots of other different processes. Whereas the original manifesto doesn't really talk about that. It says that actually more important than the processes and tools are the interactions, are the individuals, those kinds of things. It's about responding to change and navigating difficulty and chaos, and learning how to do that rather than trying to follow a plan. It's about collaborating with customers over endlessly picking over what was agreed originally, the classic contract negotiation. So I don't have a better answer than read the manifesto, because I think that if people were to read that and really think that through and think how closely their teams align with it, then they would often find ways that they can improve.
Absolutely. Okay, then. So what problems do you see with the Agile delivery in the tech industry, obviously outside of actually understanding what Agile is?
Sure. So for me, I see, like I said earlier, a lot of kind of products and tools that are available for sale, and also training courses. There are some good training courses out there, but a lot of it is geared and incentivized around selling a thing that you can then apply simply. So for example, if you take this Agile course, you will become magically more Agile. If you apply these practices that you need to then pay in order to learn how to do them, or pay for a product that allows you to do it simply, then you will suddenly be more Agile. In practice, I found that to be the opposite. I found that the more things that people buy in order to make their teams more Agile, or even sometimes the more training courses they attend in order to become fluent in a process that is supposed to be an Agile process, actually makes them less Agile and more rigid, and gets away from a lot of the kind of fundamentals of actually trying to deliver working software for a customer. So I think that the problem that we have is that the industry is incentivized around selling things in order to make people more Agile. I think that actually that's problematic, and I really think that there's a space for both a blog but also training courses and products that actually talk about how difficult it is to be Agile, and actually give people the skills that they need in order to learn how to be Agile in their context, rather than just assuming that you can buy something off the shelf. It's a little bit like telling people that if you're going on a sea voyage or a naval voyage, and you're telling people, oh well, if you just buy this product, the sea will be perfectly calm and smooth, and you'll be able to navigate it without any trouble. Or worse, the sea really should be calm, and if your sea isn't calm, then you're doing software wrong, or you're doing navigation wrong. To extend the metaphor, whereas actually what we need is people to be told the sea is going to be rough and stormy, and you're going to need to learn how to deal with that when you're out there. So I think we're teaching people to basically press a button and move their kind of navigation on a calm sea, which inevitably it never is. And then we're blaming people, or blaming the tools, or blaming the processes if the sea isn't calm, whereas in fact the sea is never going to be calm. It's always going to be chaotic, messy, and difficult, and we have to learn how to navigate that. I could go on a long time about that, but I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay, then. So what are the most important things an Agile team should be doing?
Okay, so it's all very well to say, let's follow the manifesto. What does that actually mean in practice? Most people don't know this, but if you go to the manifesto, there are some guiding principles. There are 12, I think, of them. That if you just click one link, and just behind them, there are some key practical steps that teams can take, which I've started to work through and talk through as part of the Delivery Double blog. But the key things for me are working on their communication, working on how they are talking to each other about both the software that's being delivered and also the process that they're following. I don't ever prescribe a particular process. In fact, I like to generally start with no process at all and kind of iterate from there. Depends on the seniority of the team and the experience levels of the team. Sometimes you do need a little bit of process to give them some training wheels, and that is okay. But I think for me, it's that iterative discussion about how are we working, how can we improve how we're working in our context. Alice Coburn wrote an incredible paper many years ago saying that people are basically non-linear first-order components of software processes and delivery, which basically means you cannot take a process and shove your people into it. You have to take your people and figure out what process works for them. So the most important things an Agile team should be doing are talking about their process and learning how to improve it. Most teams would call those retrospectives. Yes, as long as that isn't just part of your kind of staid, boring process. So I don't want to necessarily use that word because it's slightly overloaded, but whatever that means in your context, that's the most important thing a team should be doing.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. And if you're overseeing multiple teams, how can you improve their delivery?
Multiple teams is a real challenge, because that's where I'm at right now, and a number of people are in the position. So I think, again, there's a temptation to try and impose structure on all of your teams, because it makes things simpler and easier for you to understand what's going on, and easier for you to measure what's happening. So you have your your little backlogs and your little velocity trackers in each of your teams, and then God forbid you might try and compare the velocity of one team to another and think, oh, that team's not doing very well. Maybe I should go and intervene there because the metrics aren't great. That's a recipe for disaster, if you ask me. I think for multiple teams, the first thing that someone who is in charge of multiple teams should be doing is talking to their agile team leaders and listening to them and understanding what their pain points are and what's blocking them. I think if every sort of senior leader in an organization just did that and then tried to help fix some of those issues through managing the wider organization, that's basically your job, in order to help your teams deliver, then I think teams would be immediately more productive. Rather than trying to impose something like SAFe or something else. I just don't think that's a good idea. Dan North did a great talk. He does a great talk called Swarm, which is his new magic process to solve all kind of big company needs. And all Swarm stands for is scaling without a religious methodology, which basically means just make it up as you go and figure out what works for you in your context. It does require some experience of different processes, and it's important to try different things in the different elements of process. But the key thing you should not be doing is getting in the way of your team by imposing some big process, whether it's the Spotify model or SAFe or your particular flavor of tool that you particularly like. Just don't do it. Listen to your team, figure out what they need, and then help unblock them so that they can deliver.
Okay. What about in cases where governance needs to be enforced inside of a team, though? So obviously we're mainly just talking about the processes and the way they work, not actually about anything outside of anything, including the technical side of things. Those processes obviously can still remain, I'd assume. If you're in a team that has particular kind of statutory requirements on it or governance requirements, I've worked with teams that produce medical trial software and things like that. Those are external constraints in a team that you can't necessarily do much about. Although even if you're in a kind of medical context, it's really worth looking at what is actually required rather than the received wisdom about what we have to do. Often what's required, or certainly in some of the cases that I've worked in before when I've trained and coached teams, what's actually required is that they come up with a process that works and they stick to it. And that's fine because that's not incompatible with anything that I've said. It often isn't you have to use process X or something like that. It's often you need to be paying attention to what you're doing and intentionally being good at it. And I think that's just professionalism. And perhaps you have to write more documentation, perhaps you have to submit audits and that kind of thing. And that is part of the cost of doing business in some contexts, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that you can't innovate and iterate within those constraints in order to deliver faster. Sure. Okay, great. And if you're not the leader of a team, what can you do to actually improve?
I mean, I think everyone is in a particular context that they're in. So we've talked about teams that or leaders that have sort of multiple team responsibility. Often they're the ones who have the least control, actually. But so sometimes team leaders have a bit more control. But if you're on a team, you can often feel very powerless because you're kind of working in a day in, day out, grabbing the next Jira task or whatever the Trello task and, commenting on it, writing a pull request, repeat, and you don't feel like anything ever changes or does anything or moves or iterates. I think the key thing for me, and I wrote a blog post about this last week called How to Change Your Boss's Mind, which is all about managing up, but is to build a relationship with the person who's overseeing you and try and listen and understand and genuinely try and figure out what are the drivers behind their motivations for either imposing this methodology or maybe they've just applied it because they don't see any other choice, they don't see any other way. And if you're able to build a relationship with this person, you're then able to suggest ideas, to collaborate, to figure out how we can improve things. As a senior leader in an organization, I love it when team members come to me with ideas for how things can be better. Because often they can see things that I just can't see. We think we can see everything, and sometimes people think that senior leaders can see everything. Often they can see nothing about what's going on. It's very difficult for them to get a sense of what's going on. So if team members come to me, both as a team leader and as a senior leader, and talk to me, then assuming they're coming without guile and without an agenda and without trying to push themselves forward, but genuinely trying to improve, and you can usually tell that quite quickly, then it's really helpful. So I'd encourage you to genuinely, if you're on a team and you're feeling stuck, genuinely try and build relationship and try and understand what the dynamics are and make honest suggestions when the time is right. work on your communication.
Great. So would you say that all teams need Scrum Masters involvement?
That's a slightly loaded question. I think, no, I don't think all teams need Scrum Masters. I think teams do sometimes benefit, especially if they're more junior teams, from someone who is paying direct attention to the process so that they can, and someone with a little bit more experience about agile processes in order to help guide them. That doesn't necessarily need to be another role. It just needs to be someone in the team who is able to take on that responsibility for more junior team members. I think trying to put a bunch of inexperienced people who've never really done agile together and then say, okay, just try and figure out a process, that's not going to work. They need some tools and some methodologies. So I think teams that are in that position could benefit from either coaching or someone who's there a little bit, who's a little bit more experienced to help them to figure out what some of these processes are. Because I'm not saying all processes bad, processes are useful, but sometimes the wholesale and naive application of those processes can strangle teams' productivity. So it's about knowing and working together on which are the right pieces we should adopt in order to make our process work. So yeah, I think not all teams need Scrum Masters. We don't have any Scrum Masters at Gower Street. We have senior devs who've got a lot of experience who are able to help and suggest ideas for iterating process. I pretty much leave them to get on with it because they don't need my help to figure out a process. Having said that, if you don't have Scrum Masters, their responsibility is on the team to iterate the process and take ownership of what they are doing. They can't then blame somebody else for the fact that their process isn't improving. That's probably a good thing. I think Scrum Masters often get a bad rap because some people say they're not useful or they're not needed. So often they are hanging in there trying desperately to do a job that is impossible to do because really the team needs to take ownership of it. So I think I'm not anti the people who are doing the Scrum Master job, but I think it shouldn't be one person's responsibility to own the whole agile process for a team. That's a collective team responsibility.
Okay. I mean, essentially, I've been consulting with a few US companies recently where they've never worked in this type of way. It's always been waterfall. And now, obviously, they're now, as a business understanding, they need to be much more reactive and be able to move faster. So, obviously, without that experience inside of a team, what's the first step? Would you say put in the processes, let them see it, and then iterate on that? Or would you actually hire externally to actually bring someone in to actually try and align the team in this case?
I mean, I think for me, I think hiring externally is an excellent idea. I think hiring a consultant is an excellent idea, as long as they're good and have a track record, to try and help encourage and support the team. And they will also have a network that comes with them that will enable them to help hire experienced agile people. We had a really good experience of this where we hired, when we were hiring for data science. I'm not a data scientist, I don't know a huge amount about data science, but we decided to hire a guy called Ian Oswald, who's a data science expert based in London, a consultant, who can come in as both as a senior member of the team and talk technically about data science, but also crucially can hire and tell us what we are looking for and how to build a function that works. So that worked really well for us because he was able to basically kickstart a whole data science function. If I'd gone out to try and hire data scientists just cold, I'd have had to either talk to a recruiter, like a traditional recruiter, which doesn't necessarily, they're going to give me CVs, but they're not necessarily going to tell me what structure I need. It's the same with Agile. If you work with an experienced Agilist who really understands the fundamentals, not someone who just wants to import a process from their company, but for me is someone who's really trying to do the best thing and build a team that structurally has this culture about improvement and about judicious use of process, then that could be really, really helpful. I think it's very important for people to realize this does not happen overnight. You're basically changing the entire culture of an organization if you're trying to move towards Agile. I think the smaller the organization, the quicker it's going to happen. If it's a very large organization, it will take years to get this right, and it's best to start small. Start with a test team, bring in a consultant, help them to really prove it in the small, to prove that these ideas can work, and then slowly allow the ideas to infect the organization. Then disband that team, maybe move those people into other teams, obviously with the right thought, and slowly start to build champions and coaches internally. These kind of ideas. This is an extremely long process, and it is messy. It's like navigating that storm that I said earlier, but it's really important.
Sure. One of the questions on the chat board actually is quite interesting, essentially related to like Scrum purists. So for this guy, essentially Scrum to me is starting to feel dated, especially with like continuous deployment. Do we need a new branded process around fast delivery for new teams to help combat the Scrum purists?
I mean, people are always going to gravitate to names and brands. I mean, this is one of the reasons that, say, for example, behavior-driven development was coined again by Dan back in 2002, was because we'd kind of come up with this hybrid TDD thing that needed to really be rebranded so people understood it was a different thing. In the same way, Scrum brings together a bunch of ideas around iteration, around project ownership, and around backlogs and stand-ups, and sort of brands them and means that people can accept them wholesale. I think branded processes is a really bad idea in general. I think that what ends up happening is that consultancies spring up to try and sell those ideas to people at large. And whilst some of them, I'm sure, are doing a great job of training teams, others are just, farming out people who only know how to apply one process without being able to really think about their agile process. So I'm really worried about creating another Scrum. I mean, DevOps is sort of becoming that, and it's natural. It's just what happens. We have this whole idea about DevOps and continuous delivery, continuous integration, all of those ideas. There have been great books like the book Accelerate, which shows that DevOps works, and it's bite size, and for a senior leader in an organization, they're going to hang on to that and say, we need DevOps, we need to do this DevOps thing, and the same cycle perpetuates. It's not the first time this has happened. So I think I would prefer that we create thinking people rather than purists. I think I'd much prefer to keep Scrum as a framework process and iterate within that. If we are doing retrospectives properly, we can call it Scrum, but ultimately we can say, well, it's Scrum, but we've changed a few things. To be honest, that's the most that many teams will be able to do, but that will get them to a better place. You don't have to throw out Scrum in order to as an idea, and that can be impossible organizationally. But if you're able to iterate within that to better things, and you're able to kind of push the boundaries perhaps of what Scrum means in your organization, you're going to get quite a long way with that, and you might well get a lot further than trying to just throw out Scrum. We're going to do Kanban. That for me, that kind of wrench in an organization is usually counterproductive.
Sure. Okay, great. And also on the chat, are Scrum and continuous deployment really mutually exclusive in your mind?
Interesting. No, I don't think they are. I think you can do Scrum and deliver all the time. You could say that that's not really Scrum, but I tend to not get hung up on the terminology and just think, well, we're doing Scrum, but we just happen to be pushing everything to production when it's done, and we're using really small stories. Oh, and we're planning. We do have a planning meeting, but it's quite quick, and we tend to plan every day or two anyway when we have the right people in the room. That sounds a lot like Kanban to me. You can do that if you want to. There's no need to get hung up on the terminology unless you're being if you're in a position where the wider organization is saying you're not doing Scrum properly, then that's a separate problem and needs to be tackled separately, which is more so you're more interested in following a process to the letter than actually delivering working software faster. If you hit someone like that at a senior level in your organization, then you're going to have to really push into and engage with that person in that conversation. And if you're not senior enough to do that, you need to be engaging the person who is further up in the organization and making allies so that they can engage with that person and really make sure that we can get past this idea of what Scrum actually means or what these processes actually mean, and try to everyone around actually what we really want to do is deliver software. Let's just leave Scrum on the table for a minute. This is a better way of delivering software. It's been proven. Read the Accelerate book. It's been proven that this is better. It's better for the organization. What are your views? What do you think about that? Do you agree? And try and genuinely inquire from people who are blocking it to see what really makes them tick. Why are they doing it? Now, if it's kind of they're just trying to be difficult, then and for their own reasons, then that can be the case sometimes. But in practice, actually, most people, they either have misunderstandings or misconceptions. That most people are trying to do the right thing, and assuming that they are is usually makes for a better conversation.
Sure. Excellent. Okay then. So some more questions from the audience. What are the leading metrics and lagging metrics? What do you use to measure agile teams on?
I try not to measure agile teams' progress. I try to only at a very high level. What we tend to do at the moment is we set a 6 month organizational goals, which are mostly around revenue, and we talk about some of the things that we think would help that, and normally that's the sales teams. So a lot of my time is spent on sales and business development these days as the kind of technical voice in the room, and so I have a good understanding of what customers need, and I often will spend time trying to translate that and trying to help technical teams and educate technical teams about the business goals, because I think if technical teams are educated about business goals, then they will ship against business goals rather than against some arbitrary number of points. So I don't believe in points particularly as a good way of measuring productivity. Definitely not as a good way of measuring productivity. I tend to say you can use story points if you want to, as long as every story has 1 point. So which is obviously not using them at all. But so I much prefer. I'm happy about teams breaking down discrete measurements of work. I don't tend to measure how many stories teams have completed. I tend to measure how many users are using a new feature that we built, and how many iterations. Crucially, if I don't see the software changing all the time, that's usually a problem. I want to know why. So I'm interested in seeing iteration and feedback. I'm not interested in measuring that specifically. If I got to the point where I had so many teams that I couldn't involve myself to that kind of level with each team, so that I would want some sort of numeric dashboard, then I would be looking to appoint people under me who can take a chunk of those teams each, so that they can do the measuring through conversation and through understanding what's going on, rather than wanting a dashboard. Dashboards are so dangerous because you get to that calm sea thing again, like, oh, I can see that the sea is calm. It's just not good. Or, oh, look, the sea looks a bit choppy there. Of course it's going to be choppy in some cases. The one time where I looked at our Trello boards and I tried to do an analysis of metrics and lagging and indicators of aberrations, the one thing that it showed, because I was using statistical control checks, rather like if you read Out of the Crisis by Deming, it talks about a little bit about that kind of thing. I was trying out some of those ideas. The one aberration that I discovered was the one person 6 months ago had taken on a bit too much because he was a little bit more junior in the team, and we hadn't really checked up on him, and he hadn't really shipped for a few weeks. And we knew that anyway, so that was completely useless as a piece of information. Everything else was just normal kind of statistical variation. So I don't really believe in metrics at all. Don't think they're helpful.
That's really interesting. So you would say that it's better to base against OKRs rather than actual software metrics? Depends
what the OKRs are.
Of course, good OKRs, should we say that?
Yes. So OKRs that are focused around business success rather than number of stories shipped, because
absolutely.
An OKR is a very simple framework that you can really apply. I mean, I've read the book like everybody else. It's a good story, and I think if you pick the right OKRs, you're going to do well. If you don't pick the right OKRs, you're going to do badly.
Sure. Okay, cool. So the questions are coming in thick and fast. So opinion on Basecamp's shape up. Shape solution as you go, starting with betting on what to work on and starting with fact marker sketches. What are your views on this?
I read Shape Up when it came out. I actually was a big fan of the original blog post that they wrote a long time ago, back in sort of 2017, 2018, I think. And we actually implemented a version of that at Gower Street in early 2018, and we used it for about 18 months as an idea, this idea of pitching and 6-week development cycles, then a 2-week break, and then repeat. It worked okay for us. I think we ended up moving away from it because it wasn't quite fitting our team anymore, but it was a useful construct for us at the time. And I think the point again is that if you think it might be useful for your team and your team agrees, try it. If it doesn't work, don't use it. I don't think there is no silver bullet. Like I said earlier, people are the first order non-linear components of any software process. If your people are going to work well with it, that's great. Actually, the key reason that we got rid of it was because 18 months later, the entire development team had different just through churn. And for good reasons, people had moved on and new people had come in. And we had a completely different team and they weren't getting on with it. That's really not surprising. And the way it should be. processes aren't changing, then that's a problem. I think if processes are staying the same for too long a period with the different people, that strikes me that people are being shoehorned into a process rather than the process being adapted for people.
Okay, fantastic. You started the talk by saying that the Agile zeitgeist was moving sideways or backwards. Why do you think that is the case?
I think that, like I said, there's a lot of vested interest here. I think it's so I've done quite a lot of Agile training, and I work with some good training companies, and I've seen that in order to get market penetration with an idea in terms of training or in terms of it being a good idea, you have to push at it for several years. Often that means that the community and the ideas and the thinking has actually moved on since then, but the training tends to lag behind. So I found that the techniques and tools that I was training, I've been training quite recently, were actually invented and really the kind of the big thing in, say, 2011, 2012. And they were good ideas, and I'm happy to keep working and teaching people them. But increasingly, as I've been giving these courses, I've been saying this is the material, but it has to work in your context. Make it work in your context. And I give more and more time in the training course to the discussion around how is this going to work in your context, rather than just information. I think, unfortunately, it seems that people tend to buy informational training courses with big lists of everything you're going to learn, whereas actually what they really need is someone to kind of put them in a room and say, okay, here are some ideas. What do you think of them? How can we use them? How can we apply them? So it's much more coaching. But I think that it's quite easy to package and promote products that focus on the former rather than the kind of latter. And I think training will only ever get you so far, and it tends to stilt the conversation because people are trying to buy a thing or do a thing. Or do a methodology, or whether it's Scrum or Kanban or anything else, it tends to stilt the conversation. But that's the incentive. That's the training market for you. I think if training could be much more, here are some ideas, don't pay very much for it, and then discuss, or it could be more, okay, we need to get a coach in to really talk to us about what this really means and teach us what's going on. Then I think would be better.
Okay. Great. Okay, then. So what about planning for system architecture where business domain knowledge amongst the team is low? There's obviously a very high chance of poor choices from the offset in these circumstances. What would you recommend here? Okay,
so to make sure I understand the question, so you're in a situation where we have a team that doesn't know the business very well, doesn't understand what the constraints are. There's a need to put in some kind of architecture that will perhaps last a while, and you have to make decisions early about that, as opposed to later. What do you do? Is that the question?
Yes, I'd say so. Yeah, this is from one of the audience, but I've had similar situations where the technical lead in the business doesn't have the confidence of what's been built, so therefore wants to do all the planning work up front rather than go down an agile approach of iteration.
Yeah, so that feels like it's based on fear. I think that it's more about, I'm scared about us getting this wrong. I think going back to a particular agile principle again, which is responding to change over following a plan. It's really important that we build systems that are responsive to change. So sometimes I will select a technology, although I tend to leave this again to my team these days, but I select a technology that I don't particularly like, but it's the easiest possible thing to move away from. So it makes our data accessible and flexible so that I can make better choices later and kind of grow the architecture as I go. Sometimes that is not possible. Sometimes you have to jump on a technology early. I would suggest that, for example, you might want to pick something like, I don't know, Ruby on Rails or something, which is a big framework, which has lots of technology, lots of conventions. You could easily sort of drop any team who's familiar with it in, and they're going to be able to build a reasonably well architected website, perhaps for a while. Eventually you'll outgrow it, but that's what will happen. That's not necessarily a terrible decision. And it's a fairly safe one because you've got people in your team who understand and know the software, so that's fine. I think if you're designing a huge system to do arbitrary things that isn't just sort of using a particular framework, I think that's very dangerous. I would say it's much better to try and build something that is responsive to change that you can move away from. There's a concept called real options, which is where it's actually worth paying a cost, a development cost for having an option. So it's worth actually spending some time building something that you can then, that means you don't have to make a decision now about something that you don't understand. Hopefully it goes without saying with all of this that if you're in that position, you don't really understand the business, your key priority is to understand the business, understand what's needed. There's more I could say here about this, but I think just one final point on this is that sometimes if you're building something entirely new, you're very much in, if you read Dave Snowden's work about Cynefin, he talks about complex space versus complicated space. You're in a space where you can't predict the future, you don't know what people want. Most businesses are in this position right now because of the pandemic. So ultimately at that point, it's very dangerous to try and pick a technology and try and guess what's going to happen. You're much better off trying prototypes, maybe even writing things that you could then throw away later. Or certainly things that you can iterate to later. Don't try and build a big complicated system for a complex space. Build a simple system that basically works, test the ideas, iterate, work from there, understand the business, learn more about the business. The business is the paramount thing here.
Okay, and for those businesses that, let's say they've got a 20-year-old business, they've got a working model where everything's in place, but it's been built incredibly poorly. So there's a re-platform effort that needs to be done. In a situation like this, obviously the CEO's view would be, right, we know what we want. This is a waterfall project. Would you say that would be a fair consideration, or would you recommend a more agile approach in that type of situation?
I would always recommend an agile approach, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be pitched as one to the CEO. I think if I don't know of any business that I've ever worked with that doesn't have some replatforming to do or something. Any business of any size that has been running for any length of time has legacy craft they would love to get rid of and rewrite. I think what I tend to do with projects like that, and we do have one at the moment, to do with ID systems, we pitch the idea of what we would like to be able to do with the project when it's done. So what does this enable? So if we're pitching it to say the CEO, we would pitch, at the end of this project, you will be able to do X. It means that your systems will be more flexible. We will be able to bolt on this supplier's system to us. We'll be able to change this partner system away to another one, which will save us, I don't know, X thousand or million a year. And that will obviously help the bottom line, etc. So you pitch. So as a CTO, pitching it in business terms is a really good idea. If a CTO is interested in when that's going to be done, it's fine to give high-level estimates, ideally in months or quarters if you can manage it. But then internally, I would tend to approach that very iteratively and learn as much as we go, as much as we can as we go about exactly what's happening. And then update the CEO on expected timescales as you go. If the CEO is not comfortable at all with any risk in IT projects, then probably he's quite new at being a CEO. So I think some educating would be good there. The other thing that I find useful when I'm reporting out estimates for big projects, because you could say that it's waterfall, it will be done on the 27th of December 2021, but that's never true. So you could try that, but it's never going to work. So what I tend to do is I tend to try and report estimates or deadlines probabilistically, by which I mean I think we're 50% sure it's going to be done by the end of the year. We are 80% sure it's going to be done at the end of the first quarter, and that I find goes down better with decision makers because they're used to uncertainty and they can then plan accordingly and they can take risks accordingly with say marketing budgets or other hires or things like that. And then I continually try and refresh those estimates as we learn more about the system. What I don't try and pretend is that we are certain about a date or certain about how a project's going to go. I think even if a CEO craves that certainty, I really try very hard never to give it to them because it's not true, and it would effectively be lying. So therefore, I don't think it's helpful.
Okay.
I can say it's certainly it will be done in 3 years, but that's not helpful. So I try and be progressively less certain about things that are closer,
Sure. I definitely like that approach. That's not an approach I've heard of before, where you say, yeah, by the end of the year, 50%, by 3 months later, 80%. That's a really interesting approach I've never actually come across. So
yeah, we learned that from our data scientists.
Okay, great. Okay, then. So you mentioned at the start that you've got lots of failure stories. So one of the questions is, which of your failure stories has taught you the most? So maybe describe what the failure story was and what you learned from that.
I think the one that taught me the most is actually more about leadership than specifically about Agile. Which one? Probably the first one. So there was one case, I'll tell you this one, I haven't written about this one yet, and I'm going to soon, but where we basically did a week's worth of work that we were certain was correct. We demoed it to a customer, it's quite an important customer, and he was very nice about it. He said, oh, that's great, but that's completely not what I asked for, and we completely failed to figure out what our communication about the requirements up front. So we wasted a week's worth of work. He was very generous, and he paid for it, but still, we could have been tens of thousands of pounds out of pocket if he hadn't. So that was one that taught me a lot about Agile. That Agile is really about communication, not about getting the story cards right and shipping on time. But anyway, the key one that really I learned the most was the one which I mentioned earlier about making a difficult team announcement and accidentally lying to the team. So there's an article on the blog about this where I basically tried to be upbeat and give our team a positive message. I was running the company at the time, and things weren't going particularly well. The cash was running out. I didn't prepare properly and ended up sort of saying, oh, things are going to be fine. We'll be fine. We'll get through this. But I sort of neglected to mention the key points, which was that things were tricky. My senior team, who knew about how tricky things were absolutely furious with me, and one of them quit soon after that, which is understandable. And by sort of half communicating, I hadn't communicated at all, and I'd actually made things worse. And then when things did really hit the wall a bit later with that company, they were very shocked and surprised, and the team were just in a mess because of it. And then they all had to go and find other jobs, and that hastened the closure of the company. So it was really difficult, and I think learning that in front of a difficult conversation, or really any conversation that carries any weight, I now will tend to write several hundred words of thoughts and responses, and try and anticipate responses and questions and things that I really need to say in order to really get my message across. I've also learned that I'm the sort of person, I think a lot of us are like this, but I tend to want people to like what I'm saying and to like me and to approve of what I'm saying. And so if I've got difficult news that I know they're going to be disapproving of, it's very difficult for me to actually force myself to say it. And I have to force myself, which means writing it down beforehand and reading it so that I say it. So I think that's the key failure of my early career in leadership, was just getting that wrong.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's probably something a lot of people come across. I found the larger a company I talk to, the harder it is. So when it's just a small team, it's not a problem because they have the opportunity to ask questions back, and then the information comes out anyway. But obviously when it's larger, people don't want to put their hands up and question you. So in those cases, you do have to have it all pre-written. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so one of the other questions from the audience. If I'm not wrong, you developed an indie game. Do you feel agile methodologies can fit in the industry game industries?
Interesting. I was just drafting an article about this actually, because it's a one that's really interesting to me. So yeah, I wrote a game called Soul Trader and released it in 2016. As I was consulting, I spent a lot of my kind of non-consulting time doing that, and that was a lot of fun. And I'd love to go back into that at some point in the future. I think just biding my time really on that front. But yeah, I think it can. I think games have particular characteristics that mean that they are unique to in terms of development projects. They're often very, very front end heavy, what we would call in web development or app development front end heavy, in the sense that there's a huge amount of iteration around code and gameplay mechanics that change hugely fast as you're trying to iterate towards a fun playable game. So I found that often the basics of a business to business application or something tend to be a lot more set in stone and a lot less complex. They're complicated as opposed to complex. They're quite a lot more knowable. So I think therefore your kind of more traditional agile processes work well in those contexts. With a video game, there's so much that is unknown, and even the customer who's buying it, usually the publisher, doesn't know what they want. They want you to produce a cool game, but they don't know what the mechanics should be necessarily, and you don't know what they are either. So there's no there's really no playbook at all in terms of what you should and shouldn't be doing, which leads to code that has to be changed constantly in order to get it right. And therefore, you have to apply different practices to working with code like that than you necessarily would with working with maybe a more kind of back-end system. So I found that there's really two types of coding games. One is the high churn rate gameplay and graphics and view code and that kind of thing that I've talked about. And then there's also kind of more solid library shared processes that, like file system access and things like that, which are often provided by engines. So I have a very different approach to those two types of system. The first type, I'm very strict about testing and make sure that I really kind of build the requirements, because the customers are really the other developers in the team, and that's much more a traditional agile approach would work. With the gameplay team or the front end team, it's much more iterative and potentially changing all the time. I have because it's quite a thin layer, I tend to have much less strictures about the quality of that code, certainly until we've understood what the core gameplay is. And I'm expecting a lot more iteration, and I'm expecting code that's quick to change and that will be thrown away. So it is different. In terms of whether you can run iterations and things like that, I mean, game dev for publishers tends to work on milestones like pre-production and then vertical slice and those kind of ideas. Yes, you can use agile processes within that, but if I define agile processes responding to change and interaction individuals, then really all that's saying is we should talk about our process and improve it. So of course that stuff applies. And I don't think that a very strict waterfall style approach really works. It's certainly not in pre-production. If you're writing a game where you've got 20 levels to build, they're all being built the same, and really at this point you're just sticking them together, then that's not the same thing as trying to design a game. That's much more production, which is quite different to normally at that point you have set code routines in place and your artists are just basically creating levels and you're adding new content. That's not the same, and that doesn't necessarily, that's much more something you can run with a project management tool. It's very static and that's fine. So games are complicated beasts in terms of the way that they're produced. They're not like a typical software project where you build a tiny piece and then you build a bit more and you build a bit more and build a bit more. So yes, rules apply, but there are some particular considerations. I'm in the process of just drafting an article about this. It'll probably be quite a long one. I'm going to talk to different people in the industry, friends in the industry who can help shed more light on this and how they see agile working and that kind of thing, because I think it's not really talked about very much. It'd be quite useful to put more information out there about it.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're coming near the end now, so get your last questions in now, guys. We've got one that's slightly a little bit off topic, but I think it's interesting to know as well. I'm curious to know what a chief film officer actually does.
Chief Film Technology Officer is my role. So the reason that I took on that title specifically, so I was CTO of the company for a couple of years, and that was a much more traditional role in the sense that I had the development and data science teams. For various reasons that are specific to our company, at that point I took on both our theatrical insights teams, who are responsible for really talking about the state of the box office, which if you're interested, go to gower.st and read our blog. It's pretty shocking out there right now because all the cinemas are closed in the world. But yes, so they're responsible for that output and that content. And then I also took on managing the film analysis team, whose job it is to kind of power our central product with kind of insights into how films are going to do when they come out. So just very briefly, our product allows big movie studios to kind of move films around in the calendar to kind of see what might happen. It's a predictive tool. So what I do is because I manage all of those teams, Chief Technology Officer didn't seem appropriate. It's more of an operational role because I manage all of that, but there is a technical component. However, we're really trying to push in the same way that there's a fintech and there's an ad tech and other different types of kind of technology disrupting traditional industries. We really wanted to push this idea of film tech, which is not really a concept that's really come around yet. So we're trying to push this concept as an idea, because this is effectively what we are. We're a film tech company disrupting a more traditional movie business with technology. So hence Chief Film Technology Officer was kind of a way to do that, to show that we can fuse these things together and push this forward as an idea. So it was one way that it generates conversations rather like this one with customers. Like, oh, okay, what does that mean? And then we can talk about it. So titles are just tools, right? And they communicate. So that was the motivation for that particular title.
Great. Are you the only man in the world with that title, do you think?
Probably. I have no idea.
Okay, then. So it's come to wrapping up. So, okay, what's one thing everyone can do to work better in an Agile team?
One thing everyone can do. One thing every team can do is to run retrospectives in whatever form, talk about how they can improve, and maybe be a bit brave and maybe go beyond the confines of what is received wisdom about their process. One thing every person can do is engage in conversation, be intentional about engaging in conversation with the people around them, whether that's their boss or their team or even their peers, about how we can improve. How can we actually get back to deliver working software as opposed to, filling in tickets? I think so. Be intentional and engage in conversation, and try and start a conversation about moving forward.
Okay, fantastic. And my very last question for you now, then, where should people go if they want more help?
Okay, so on deliverydouble.com, there's a bunch of free material there that you can read. Hopefully that's helpful. There's also, if you click on the homepage, there's a free email course that you can take that I put there. So it's an 8-lesson email course. It kind of takes you through these ideas step by step over about 3 weeks, and allows you kind of to start implementing some of these conversations, some of these processes. You can also, if you sign up to that course, it will actually personalize for you. So you can answer a few little questions which say, for example, I'm running multiple teams or I'm just a member on a team, and I've personalized the course for individual people's circumstances, so that their particular questions and also their kind of seniority level will reflect the material in the course. So hopefully that's helpful to everyone.
Okay, great. I've just added that in the message chat now of the deliverydouble.com, along with the LinkedIn and Twitter information too. Okay, then. So we're just coming to an end now. So thank you, Chris, for taking the time for talking to us today. It's been excellent.
No worries. Sorry about the technical glitch at the beginning.
No problem at all. It always happens. It happens now and again. So yeah. So all Chris's details are in the chat, like I just mentioned. So if you want to follow up, ask any further questions, his LinkedIn's in there, along with his website and his Twitter user handles. We'll have more CTO Craft Bytes sessions coming in July, so please keep an eye out on Eventbrite for those coming up. They're not up on Eventbrite just yet. And thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. So thank you very much for your time, Chris.